Hello, my name is Alfred Jones, and this is my visual project for week 14, which covered the conservative resurgence. I started with this illustration, which is for the thesis of the textbook chapter. In my opinion, this covered a lot of the ways that Reagan was able to become president by such a wide margin. He did this by appealing to many groups of Americans, such as neoconservatives, which was a group who believed that the 1960s had produced a decline in moral standards and respect for authority. For example, they argued that welfare not only failed to alleviate poverty, but also encouraged single motherhood and undermined the work ethic. This is why I have neoconservatives pointing towards the crowd, and one of them is saying, "No more welfare." As well as this, Reagan was able to recognize that the Christian conservatives seemed most agitated by the ongoing sexual revolution, which they saw as undermining the traditional family and promoting immorality. The ERA challenged this traditional family value, which is why I have this pointing towards the ERA is bad. It's being said by a Christian conservative. As well as this, Reagan, formerly being a Democrat, was able to gauge that he could appeal to Democrats that would move to the Republican Party because of their objection to things such as affirmative action. These people became known as Reagan Democrats, which I have pointed to here. My next illustration is the thesis in the recorded lecture, because I believe a lot of it reflected the slogan that Reagan originally used, which was "Make America Great Again." As stated in the lecture, "Making America Great Again" came from Reagan in the 1980s, who was referring to the 1950s. Reagan was able to gain office by riding the wave of backlash against the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s and calling for the return of the 50s. My visual gives a reminder of the things that Reagan, whether he meant it or not, implied by calling for a return of the 50s. In the individual letters, I wrote things such as segregation, lynching, traditional conservative values. I sort of just wrote that a bunch of times, because that's sort of the meaning behind the message, in my opinion, as well as the video lecture. For the last illustration, I used comments of two of my classmates to make a visual representation of what Reagan's economic policies resulted in, which was a widening of the gap between the poor and the rich. By the time Reagan completed his tax cuts, the wealthiest in America were paying less than 30% in taxes, which was down from 80% in the 1950s. Brendan Gutman stated that this heavily affects the nation's society because this allowed the rich to keep getting richer, which eventually led to the richest 1% of Americans owning 40% of the nation's wealth, increasing the economic class gap and inequalities. On top of this, Riley Thompson in my class mentioned that public housing was also underfunded and many mental hospitals were closed, creating a homeless problem in many big cities. This perspective represents the side of Reagan's policy that directly impacted Americans in a negative way. So here I sort of have like a scale, which they're empty on each side, which is why it's an even scale, but on the way down is two 20-pound weights of public housing being underfunded and mental hospitals closing, as well as a balloon which would sort of pull the rich up because their taxes are being cut. So the scale was tipped heavily in the rich's favor. And this is the full poster. Thank you.